Everyone, and welcome to Basic Portrait Lighting. I'm Joe Brady, and here on set, the one and only Tony Corbell.
Hey, everybody.
Tony, we're going to do something a little different today.
You know, we wanted to do a show and answer some of the questions that we keep coming in. Since we started these Bowens shows especially, and the teambowens.com blog, we get a lot of questions, very, very active community starting up there. So it's really fun. And a lot of the questions came in about portraits, just in general questions about portraits and creating portraits and lighting for portraits. So we thought, instead of trying to be very specific, let's show a few pictures. Let's go through some of Joe's portrait work, some of my portrait work, and explain what we were thinking at the time, a little bit about how they were done, how they were lit, and why, and then start taking some questions from you guys.
So as Tony mentioned, what we're going to do is we're going to start by taking a look at a couple of different portraits and talk about how it's not just the position of the lights or the lights that you use, but how we're after the goal of crafting a story. And I think your word was that we're not just going to take a picture.
Well, I think, yeah, the comment that I heard from my friend Arthur Rainville years ago was, a photograph is of someone, but a portrait is about someone. And that raises your responsibility a little bit, but it also puts everything at a different level. And you are responsible for not just getting a recording of what someone looks like, but you've got to tell a story about a little bit about them. And that requires a little more effort. So it's a whole different ballgame.
One of the things we talked about earlier, we were just chatting, was people who say they are natural light photographers. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that there's somebody who sees that as a red flag when they're trying to hire people.
I know that one of the larger entertainment companies in Orlando, who shall remain nameless, the big one down there, one of the big ones down there, they hire a lot of photographers for their work. And if people on their resume put, you know, I'm a natural light photographer, they won't interview them, because it is a little bit of an indicator that they probably don't use flash outdoors. They don't. Maybe it's because they don't know how, or maybe they just haven't learned to. But down there, where you've got to work even at noon, it's required that you almost have to understand everything about light control, and that's speed light and natural light. So I think it's important to learn that, and we're going to kick that off here and start talking about that.
We're going to take a look right with that. Even we don't get it wrong that we don't love natural light.
Oh, we'd much rather work in natural light, but we can't always. So
the sun doesn't always cooperate. The time of day doesn't always cooperate.
Shadows are not where we want them sometimes in relation to the background. So
you need to learn to control and put light where it is needed. And let's start with that. Even on a bright sunny day where you think you might have great natural light, adding a little bit of fill light with a flash will open up the shadows, or put that nice catch light in the eye, add some life to the portrait. So let's actually start with looking at an image that has no light. It's just a portrait. Yes, it's exposed correctly, but because there's no light on the subject, she kind of just disappears into the background.
Yeah, and again, when you bring in a flash, it just looks like the picture is a little bit more polished. It just looks like it looks like you finished it off. This is one of Joe's, and it just looks like she's finished, as opposed to her face was a little dark,
and she's separated from the background. There's you can actually see her now. Yeah. So in the studio, we're used to using lights.
Sure. And
when we are doing studio lights, then we have a whole bunch of other considerations because it's our primary light. We're not adding to it. Right. So let's take a look at our good friend Bethany. And this is a very, very, very gentle lighting ratio. It's almost no ratio at all. It's about 1.5 to 1. Slightly short lit, but generally, your eye goes to the brightest thing in the scene. It's one thing we usually see. In this case, when the overall scene is very bright, you have a tendency to go to the dark. And in this case, her dark hair framed her face, and you are drawn to that. You mentioned something about the familiar.
Yeah. So as I was taught early on, that the human eye, the nature is that your eye goes to, first and foremost, the lightest area in the photograph. It'll also go to the sharpest area of the photograph, and it'll also go to what is most familiar. And then couple that with we talked also about this.
Your eye goes to red first as far as colors.
Right, and then also it'll go to the minority. So like, I was telling Joe, if you've got a dozen eggs, and you've got one of those eggs that's not white, it's a little off-white, your eye goes to that egg because it's the minority. Yeah. So it's just compositionally and visual communication-wise, it's just something to be aware of. That your area of minority sometimes gets the loudest direct view from the viewer.
And actually, the first time I heard that worded that way was this morning. chatting with Tony, and there's an image, you'll see a portrait a little bit later, where that's exactly what's happening. I never heard it phrased that way, but it's a perfect explanation. This is a 3-light portrait in studio. Again, short lit, hair light, little light spilling onto her back, and then a background light to open that up. Now, the pose of this does create a different kind of sense. Yes, it's a dramatic lighting, but because her shoulders turned away and the look back to the camera, it does kind of say, oh, separation. There's not a warmth to it. And that's okay if that's what you want to say, but if we look at the next image where we had her rotate her shoulders back around and added a colored gel to the background, now she's more engaged. Now there's maybe a little bit of a challenge to it, but it shows a strength, and we have this almost Rembrandt lighting with, again, the light on the hair, light on the shoulder, light on the background that is separating her out.
And the viewer's drawn in just a little bit more.
Yeah, you're really drawn
Sure.
to her eyes on this.
Sure.
Now, we've both talked about black and white. You like black and white portraits
I'm
as
a huge
well.
black and white fan.
So let's take a look again, completely different mood with black and white, single large softbox coming off from the left, hair light on the hair to separate it from the black background, becomes more of a design element. And in general, when I'm photographing a portrait, I like to leave some empty space in the direction that the subject is looking. So with her looking to the left, that's why I have her positioned off to the right.
Yeah, the old masters called it looking into the photograph, not looking out of the photograph.
Right, if she was turned around looking the other way,
Right.
You'd be confused as to what's going on. Yeah. So we've talked about a little bit of studio stuff. How about using flash outside? You think that's something that's probably the biggest hurdle people face?
I think it is, and half these questions that I'm looking at are dealing with that. So I think it's something we should talk about. And I think that with just a little bit of effort, you really can gain a lot of control over working outdoors with flash.
So let's jump in and take a quick look at some outside portraits. This was a shoot we did with our friend Gabby, a very talented young lady, and we were in a completely shaded spot. So even though it was outdoor, it was almost like shooting in studio because our lights were going to be the primary light. It's just a single softbox in this case, just off to center a little bit. Again, short lit, creates a nice, pleasing, slightly dramatic portrait. Now, however, doing something that I didn't usually do, I brought the softbox in close and very low. And if you look at her eyes, it created this really big kind of square catch light. Almost looks like a Hummel figurine or an anime character. Kind of creates a different feeling to it. Then adding a prop. So let's take a look here. We brought in a parasol. We've now got a light and a reflector. So we've got the main light slightly to our left, a reflector off to the right. And in this case, the light at the parasol, there's actually a speed light hidden behind her back that's shooting up into the parasol to make sure that that gets lit up. Now, talking about posing and mood, the same exact scene, but changing camera position and the way that Gabby is facing. This goes back to that comment you made before, that your eye goes to
The lighter, initially you're going to go to the lighter area. It just draws you over there.
and the familiar.
Sure.
And by having that dark area off to the right, in this country anyway, since we read from left to right, you come into the picture, you've got the light area, Gabby is looking off into the distance. That kind of looking off to the right also symbolizes a looking off to the future. So there is some symbolism there. But the dark background behind her causes you to back into the photograph again. So again, full shade outside is nice. It's almost like studio. It's easy to control.
Right.
But we've got a different set of challenges when we're in a full sun.
Full sun is the area that seems to be the biggest issue. And a lot of it is because of the sync speeds, for one thing. Syncing the flash with your shutter speed and the limitations that some cameras have, as opposed to some that will allow, and flashes that will allow high-speed sync mode. That really fixes a lot of problems by being able to utilize that high-speed sync mode. Let's go to the next picture here, Rick, and you'll see this is one of those that Joe did that I think it's a really nice picture. But again, reading left to right, as you come in to see her, your eye automatically leaves and escapes and goes off to the right and up and out of the frame. And I think that's an area where maybe a little vignette would help a little bit, but Joe came up with a very clever response here, how to fix that.
Two solutions for something like this. Well, one, you could just crop it.
Sure.
Make it a vertical or
Sure.
a square image and get rid of that because the bright river scene in the background, being on the right, takes you out of the frame. But since there was no text, there was no things that you were going to read in, I thought, well, just flipping this horizontally would probably make it a much better image, and it does. It doesn't even look like it's the same photograph. And again, you've got that reading left to right. we end up at Gabby's face. Again, a big softbox, fairly close, up underneath with a little bit of a rim light. But the dark tree trunk on the right now serves as a visual block. It keeps you from leaving the image, and you get to focus again on Gabby. One more example, same exact thing. Let's just take a look. Again, same position. What was added was a speed light was brought in. You can see on the right side of the image on her arm, it's separating out from the background, but you still have the problem of that bright area off to the upper right. So flip it. Let's take a look at it the other way. And it works.
Yeah.
It just becomes a much better image. And then
It just reads differently, for sure.
sometimes you've got a background where you can't do that. You don't have that stopping thing. So let's take a look at this next image, and we can see, well, the background's too bright, and there's nothing to stop. And this is a time where, well, I guess the solution is what? Shutter speed?
The shutter speed is the answer, and you know, this is something that we talk about. You know, off camera, we talk quite a bit about this thing, and we try to, we learn from each other, and we learn from all of you as well. And one of the things that you learn over the years is that when you increase your shutter speed in a flash outdoor situation, in order to bring down the background areas and ambience, remember that you're not just bringing down the sky and the background, you're also bringing down shadows. Any area of ambience will be controlled as you bring your shutter speed higher and will be made to look darker. So you're also making your shadows look darker. At the same time, you're making the light areas look darker.
It actually partially answers one of the questions we already had, where someone said, how can you add more drama? How can you add a little more grungy look? If you're in an outdoor,
Add more light.
add more light
Sure.
and increase your shutter speed,
Sure.
which will
Sure.
deepen those shadows. So let's take just a quick look at the result here. What we've got, here's our bright background just by increasing the shutter speed. Notice the light on Gabby hasn't changed. What's happened is the background has gotten darker because of that increased shutter speed.
Yeah, and she looks a little bit, it's a little bit better picture because it seems like the light is more directional. So by bringing down the shadows, it also directed the viewer's attention where the light is coming at a different angle.
So let's move on a little bit and let's take a look at a couple of images that maybe some different lights are used, and then I'm going to switch over. I want to take
Sure.
a look at some of yours.
Yeah.
This first one was actually shot using video lights.
Right.
Little square video lights that Bowens makes. They're LED light sources. One in the back seat, kind of coming down across. The other one just to the left of the camera position, illuminating. This is our friend Ivy here. And again, when you're in a small situation, sometimes it's difficult to bring your light shapers in. Can't get a 3 foot by 4 foot softbox inside the car. So
You have to figure these things out, folks, and that's the thing that a lot of young photographers miss. When you're asked to come onto a scene, asked to come into a shoot, you have to somehow find a way to figure it out, and you got to come back with a picture. And so if you're inside that car situation, either you don't want to or can't use a flash for whatever reason, those little small video lights are a great solution. And you see more and more wedding photographers starting to use them every day. Either they're little LEDs or some type of light source. But you can put them anywhere. They're small, they're unobtrusive, and sometimes you don't need very much light. You just need a little bit of help.
And light is light.
Light's
wherever
light.
it's coming
It is.
from.
It is.
Now, even times when you have a nice window light, sometimes it's still not enough. So let's take a look here, and there's a couple reasons why a flash had to be brought in. Now, one of the things that might not be obvious at first glance is if you need to change the ratio of light to dark with window light, the usual answer is to change the distance of your subject to that window. Bring them in closer, you're going to get a higher light ratio. Further away from the window, it's going to become more subtle. However, in this case, Paula was sitting at a piano, a grand piano that we couldn't go rolling around the room all that easily. So a light in a softbox was positioned off to the left, and it had the effect of opening up the side of her face and adding a beautiful catch light. So again, you have to adapt the tools to the situation.
Sure.
Outside, let's go ahead outside. This is an outside shot, but it ended up being in full shade because the sun was casting a shadow over this wall. This is a single softbox with a light. And because it's a big surface and fairly close to her just off camera to the right, able to illuminate both the subject and the wall to add some separation there. Now we talked, you mentioned about storytelling and telling something about the subject. The light ratios, the drama, the positioning, and the pose, and the composition
They all
of face.
speak to something about the subject.
So that's going to have a big effect on that. So this next shot is a photograph of a friend of mine, Vinny, and he's a very gentle soul. He's a kind person. I wanted to have that kind of conveyed during the image.
He's got good eyes.
He does. He's a happy guy. He's a gentle man. And the light ratio, because of that, I wanted to keep it gentle. So this is maybe 2 to 1, something around that, very gentle light ratio. Loop lighting, just a slight loop off to the one side of the nose. If you're not sure what lighting style to use on someone, loop's probably a good place to start because it's a fairly universal working thing. So again, nice pose, just gentle, conveys something about the subject. Now, something completely different. Let's take a look at something very dramatic. This is one of the Cirque du Soleil performers, and very dramatic pose. She could put her body in all kinds of positions. But the background when we were shooting here was extremely ugly. It was hideous. So it required bringing up the shutter speed in a dark area and just using a single light. This is just one single big reflector, not a softbox, because then
And you could be almost anywhere working.
Yes,
your environment doesn't really matter.
Right. So this is with a strobe. You can also achieve similar effects, maybe not quite as dramatic, with continuous light. So this next shot is actually a continuous light, something like the Bowen's 530 or 550 stream lights that have the fluorescent tubes with a sock, kind of forms like a beauty dish. So you have the light on the subject fairly close, and then it falls off very quickly. Again, to add drama, sometimes the pose and the positioning will do that. So let's take a look. This is our friend William. And what I did, this is just 2 soft boxes, one to the left, one to the right. Had to bring the one on the right side of the frame down to illuminate underneath the hat a little bit. And I cut out part of the background to give it that real 3D effect with his hands coming out at you.
Yeah, outside the frame, it looks good.
Then lastly from me, this is Kat, and this is actually a green screen shot. And when you're shooting green screen, it's very important that your background is illuminated evenly. So this is actually a 5 light set. There's a big softbox to the left in this image, a smaller one to the right, a hair light coming down that's illuminating her hair and her shoulder, and then 2 umbrellas that are illuminating the background. When you're shooting something for green screen, it's important that your lighting pattern matches what you're going to put it in.
And you know, one of the interesting things about this is, as you develop your skills and start moving forward, it's all about the word control. And for me, at least, when I teach workshops, and I teach a lot of lighting workshops, it's all about being in control. That is the single most important thing. It's defined as having the power and authority to guide or manage, is what control means. And for me, I don't ever want to be caught off guard. I don't want to be stuck on a shoot because I don't understand what's going on. I've got to understand how to control everything. Let's take a look at this next portrait. This is a couple in Minnesota that I photographed recently. You know, this is a beautiful, beautiful location. This person's home, which is really nice. It doesn't look lit, but I had to light them. I really wanted to light the couple separate and make it look as natural as I could. The accent lights coming in on her hair, on her right side of her face, and his right side of his face on his cheekbone. That just gave me extra separation, and that's ambient light sort of coming around the corner, if you will. And I positioned them there for that reason. But the light on them, the primary source, I tried to match it up with the softness of the ambience. And that's a requirement I have because I've got to be able to pull this picture off, and I can't do that if I'm not under control. So that's pretty huge. Now this next picture, this is an interesting picture because I brought this. This is a studio shot that I did in Santa Fe maybe 2 years ago. And I don't often light the broad side of a subject's face. In other words, the widest side of the face. But in this case, I felt that the need to because her hair was so big and there was a lot of her hair that was on her left, over her left eye, that her face was open on the right side of her face, camera left. So I lit from the camera left position to go into, if you will, the open side of her face.
What's interesting about this particular image is that when you're doing broad lighting, it does have the effect of spreading out the face.
Yeah, it does add, it seems to add a little bit of weight.
But since you used such a high lighting ratio, since the far side of her face was so dark, only half of her face was lit, so it had a neutralizing effect. It didn't make her look wider.
Yeah, but the face like that, you can light in any manner. So it's hard to miss.
Tony's going to go through a couple more images, and then we have a whole bunch of questions. So as soon as we're just finished with this kind of preamble, then we're going to start getting your questions. And some of them have been actually answered from what we've shown you already, but we're going to get right into that in just a second.
So next here, I wanted to talk about a couple of things. This, back to finding out a little bit about someone. Can you tell this woman on the left is a dancer? I mean, clearly she was dancing in the studio, and basically it's not about a true exposure on her face. It's not about what she truly looks like, but it is about a feeling. And sometimes a portrait about feeling can be this. You can not show and not reveal the exact look of someone's features, but the idea of their features. And then the one next to it, this woman, this is backstage at an event in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she was a dancer backstage, and there was one assistant running around with a long monopod, and at the end of the monopod was a small speed light with a softbox, and we'd worked out the exposure for the distance from the softbox to the subject, and as long as we stayed consistent with that distance, we could do anything. We could move that light in any position. We could light anybody any way, as long as the position and the distance remain the same. And that's the beauty sometimes of working with a manual exposure.
How do you deal with color? So you've got clothing, you got a background. People are always asking about, if you're going to gel, what color background is going to look best for skin?
I think that's always a good question, and it often depends on the overall, and we were talking about this, the overall usage of the picture. Is this for them? Is it going to go on their wall, or is this for a portfolio piece, or is this an ad? And if it's an ad, is it an upbeat magazine? Is it a very contemporary magazine, or is it very traditional? You need to know sort of, I teach my workshop students to always start with the end in mind. Anytime you're going to light a set, pose a client, determine where you're going to shoot, the ratio of shadow, all of those things really do depend on the overall usage.
But for a general family portrait, you'll find that most people are going to use a cooler color background for skin tones.
Yeah, cooler color background is going to offset the skin more. Look at this next portrait. This is a workshop model from last year in Texas, and basically I saw what she was wearing, this light purple, this periwinkle lavender color top, and I thought, okay, well, I'll put a purple gel, and the only purple gel I had was a really dark one, and so I powered a lot of light through it to bring its level up, so it's much lighter than the true tonality of the gel. But you can't forget too, you look at this next series of photographs we're going to talk about, goes to and speaks to the personality of the subject. Now in this case, this is a woman who, I was very fortunate to get to go to Dubai last year and do a workshop in the capital city in Dubai. And this woman is on the news there. She's an anchor for the national network station. And one photograph doesn't capture her at all. So the next one, if you'll look at this one, she's looking right into the lens. So the first one, she's smiling, she's nice. Now she's looking right at the lens. She's very direct. The next one, she's starting to get a little bit goofy, and she's just kind of playing with the camera a little bit. And then the final one is more of her true personality. This is her. She's a nut, and she's very, very funny. She's just very open and very fun. So I've got to be sure that at the end of the day, I capture that. I cannot miss that in the photographs.
So how do you choose one of those? It's almost like the sequence.
Well, that's
really
why I put all four of them up there.
Okay.
Sometimes, one picture is not enough. And the beauty about digital and digital printing is we have that option. We can make a triptych or however we want to do it to produce 1, 2, 3, 4 images in the same frame.
So if color's not important,
Then I've become a black and white fan, and I wasn't for years. When I was shooting my heaviest portrait work in my studio, I was mostly color. But with the advent of some of the black and white software and certainly Silver Effects and some of the other products that we've all used, take a look at this next slide. There's a couple of black and whites here that color just didn't help me much. So I put them in black and white and found that I liked the pictures better. They spoke to me more. And
now
so
how about, okay, sorry, go ahead.
no, I just felt that it needed a little bit of a black and white hit.
So how about when you're dealing with kids? We just did a shoot yesterday, or you just shoot yesterday
we
with
did.
a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
And we had moms on the set.
Yeah.
And I know in our studio, we don't let moms say the S word.
Right.
They say smile, tell the kid to smile once.
They're out.
We give them one warning. then we send them away.
Yeah.
But how do you deal with a kid, and do you always want smiles? Or
I think there are quiet moments that you have to get with a child, and for their true features to come through, and big smiles don't always capture the most, and not all kids are big smiley kids.
Yeah. Let's take a look at the next image.
This next image is a great little 10-year-old, my new favorite pal Nicholas, who I photographed in Dallas, and photograph of him became an ad for Bowens, and it's going to be, it's featured in all the photo magazines, and the picture is him without a shirt on, eating watermelon, it's just all over him, and he's just laughing hysterically. But I couldn't let him leave without getting this picture, because this is also his personality. And I think Mom and Dad need to see this. I think this is a little bit about him as well. I didn't tell him to be quiet. I didn't tell him to settle down. He just stopped. And I just said, just look right in here, just look right in the barrel of the lens, right there, right there, right there, bam. And this was him as well. So it's not always about being smiley and loud and fun, and sometimes you've got to get that one as well.
I prefer that kind of portrait.
I love this portrait of him.
All right, so we got a lot of questions to get to. I'll answer this one first so it's a little bit fresher in your mind. Somebody asked, how did I keep the green out of Kat's hair on that green screen shot?
Oh, yeah.
And there's two ways it happens. One, get your subject away from the background. I had her probably 8 feet in front of the background, so there's not enough blowback to come into her hair. But even with that, if the background is lit, and by the way, the background, generally when I do green screen, is lit to the same power as my main light on the face. Because it's enough to illuminate it, but not enough to cause blowback. If you do get a little, the green screen softwares have actually gotten pretty efficient, and they actually have a slider that will look at the edges and reduce green on the edges so that it's clean. So that's what I'd recommend. I don't want to get into details of that today, but if you have questions, we'll give you email reference. Send me a note. I'll show you the software we use.
Sure. One of the things that I noticed that there's a recurring question in here about percentages with flash and ambience outdoors. And I just wanted to address this and see if this might take care of about half the questions. I live and breathe and die by my L758DR light meter. And those of you that know me know that I don't go to work without that meter in my hand. Working flash and ambience together, that meter will read both, and it'll give you a percentage. And several of you commented on 30% percentage. 30% percentage with that meter, when you take a flash reading outdoors with that meter, in the upper right corner, a little percentage number pops on. And that number tells you what is the percentage of flash to the overall exposure. In other words, at 30%, it's telling me that flash is making up 30% of the photograph, 70% is being made up by the ambience. 30% is a real good number to use if you want your flash to appear as a fill light. Okay, so that's the way I look at it. I only look for 3 numbers, by the way, when I use flash with that meter. 30% is perfect for a fill light. 50% is 1-to-1. 50% my flash and my ambient light match each other, and it's a good mix. Very clearly, you can see that there was flash there, but it didn't override anything. Pardon me. And then finally, up around 60, 70%, 80% flash, that's very clearly that flash is a main light, and that the ambience is then my fill, if that makes any sense. And that's overpowering that ambient light. So for me, I'm always looking for a 30% for a fill, 50% for a neutral, 1-to-1, and 60, 70, 80% if I want that main light to come from the flash. Think of it this way. At 30%, you have the option of making your background and your ambience brighter than it truly is. At 50%, it can look just like it really looks. And at 70%, it looks darker than it really looks. So those three factors are in my head all the time.
So one of those 50% times might be when you have somebody underneath a shade, a tree or something, and they've got a bright background
and there may be something in the background that needs to look like it really looks.
Yeah, so you want to even it out.
Sure.
That's where you might.
So the reality has to exist in the background somewhere.
So let's back up. I see we had talked about this, one basic question that everyone wants to know. What would you recommend as either must-have gear or maybe a good starting point for someone getting into this a little more?
Well, in the studio, certainly you need to start with at least 1 or 2 heads. If you're looking for a starter kit, I would consider that little Bowens 400RX kit. It's 2 heads. You're in the U.S. market, you're well under $1,000 for 2 heads with a little case, light stands, umbrellas. I mean, it's a pretty full little set of lights that are bulletproof. These lights the cases are metal. They're very, very well made, very, very solid lights. And for me, that's a good place to start. And then light shaping tools sort of to suit your taste and what you're going to do with these lights.
So what's the first one you'd get? If you had to live with one light shaping tool, what would be the first one you'd get?
Well, if you had asked me a year ago and any time in the last 25 years, I would say a medium softbox. But
I'm going to go get it. I know what he's going to say.
but this year I've become a fanatic about octabanks, and I'm not quite sure when that started with me. Maybe it's because I started doing more testing this year, but this year I'm really using an octabank a lot more than I've ever used it before, and I'm finally understanding it. And I think maybe that was my problem in the past, is I didn't understand how to use this thing. Well, now I get it. Now I understand how to use it. And I used it yesterday on this shoot. I used it on that ad shoot that I did for Bowens with this delightful little boy with watermelon. I'm using it a lot more now, and it really is a great, sweet light source for me.
I haven't used it a lot myself. Tony's kind of got me convinced to start using it. One of the things I noticed about this versus a softbox is the fall-off pattern is different. So if you have that light centered on a face, but you want to do a full length, it sends light around enough, but there's a gradual fall-off from the center, more so, I would think, than with a softbox as it goes down. So it focuses on the face, yet illuminates the rest of the figure.
And that's one of the questions that I noticed when we had cut away just a minute ago. One of the questions that came in is, what's the difference between a softbox and a beauty dish if they were about the same size? It's all about the fall off. The beauty dish is a real sweet light source, but the beauty dish is kind of tricky. If you work a beauty dish quite a distance away from your subject, especially a face, if you're doing a headshot, it becomes a small light source just like anything else, like a small standard reflector head. But if you bring that beauty dish in closer to your subject, then you're seeing something that's a little bit unique and pretty special, and that is that hot spot. There's a sweet spot on a beauty dish that when your subject's the mask of the face, is dialed into that center sweet spot of a beauty dish, there's not much that look better than that. I mean, it really looks nice, and the fall off is a great fall off. Whereas a softbox is a little bit more of a mushy fall off, if that makes sense. Can I say the word mushy? Is that?
I don't know if we might have to censor that.
We might have to censor that one, but mushy is,
The thing about, one of the other things about a beauty dish is the fact that it's round. It creates a very nice round catch light in the eye compared to the rectangle. It's all what you're after, and it's all how much control of the light you need. One of the nice things about the softboxes, and we could show one over here, is that you've got these side panels. Let me pull this grid off just for a second. You've got the recessed panels here that give you more control as to determine how much of the light's going to go in the background, where is it going to shape around the subject. So where the beauty dish, you have this kind of beam of light that's coming out.
Yeah, it follows the shape of that dish as it comes out.
So it's learning to use the tools, and we're going to continue to do a lot of that over the next year between the two of us and a bunch of guests on really nailing down what each of these light shaping things
and it might be, this might be a good time for me to talk about the umbrella for just a moment.
Actually, another question that comes up all the time, umbrella versus softbox. So Tony, why don't you take us there?
One thing I can tell you is if you log into teambowens.com, I just did a video on this that's posted about the difference between a softbox and an umbrella. But I specifically wanted to show a couple of things about this. Let me just grab this. You know, when this is set in its proper position for the subject, you're never quite sure how much, in all umbrellas, any brand, you can determine the distance of the umbrella from the front of the head this way. So I can bring it closer this way, or I can move the umbrella further away from the head and move it out further. The difference is that the further it is away from the head, the softer the light appears. The more it lights the entire bell, if you will, the inside of the umbrella. If you need that light to be a little bit more specular, a little bit more focused, and a little bit more directional, then you want to bring it down and light a smaller area here. So then it becomes a reflected light source of 16, 18, 20 inches around. So it's an interesting how that works. And there's a little bit of fall off. Generally speaking, if you're in the studio and you're with one person and you're trying to figure out where do you set this thing up, here's what I would recommend. Let me turn this sideways to the camera. So right there, I'm exactly sideways. Now you can see as I push it out, now I'm starting to see the edge of the light source of the small reflector head. Bring it down until they even each other out. Something like that. Lock that in right there. And there's a couple of things about that are good. One is I don't have to worry about flare. If I need to feather this a little bit, if I even feathered it right there, I'm not going to get flare in my lens. Whereas if it were pushed a little bit further away, there's a chance of getting flare if I tip back this way slightly. So it gives me a good balancing point there. I think working with an umbrella is a terrific It's a terrific tool, but it's a tool that is not very controllable. An umbrella sends light everywhere, and that's both its greatest attribute and it's also its biggest problem. If you're trying to control light in a small studio with white walls and you're using umbrella lighting, forget it. There's no control. You just hold on and do whatever the meter tells you to do.
That said, there are two times for me that it's really important to use umbrellas. Well, one, like when we were doing that green screen or you want to light up a back wall, you do want the light to flow out and go everywhere.
Yeah.
And in that case, generally another rule of thumb, again, these are guidelines. We say rules, none of this is rules.
Yeah, they're just
this is
guidelines.
photography, they're starting points. But in general, and again, somebody asked the difference between using strobes and speed lights. One of the big advantages of strobes is you have this modeling light. And that's to push it out until the modeling light is completely illuminating the entire umbrella. When you do that, then you're getting the biggest light source for flooding the background. The other time you might want to do this, and Tony and I have both done this many times, you shoot in a large group. You're not going to individually create light ratios that way. You need to illuminate. You just did something like 85 people?
Yeah, for Kelby down in Florida. We shot 85 staff members, and we lit this entire scene with 6 umbrellas, and lit every face, and all the faces were evenly illuminated, and it turned out pretty good. But you've got to have big, sort of a good wash or splash of light that's even enough to cover large areas like that.
Somebody asked about, just to go back to basics a little bit, ratios. We understand, you know, there's a lot of people here joining us today.
Yeah.
And we can't cover everything there is to know about lighting in this one little session. However, when we talk about ratios, we're talking about the amount of light on the lit side of the face versus the shadow side of the face. So if we say 2 to 1, it means the shadow side of the face has half as much light hitting it as the lighted side.
It's funny, I learned this from a master photographer that used to say, is it a 2 to 1 ratio or is it a 1 to 2? And then he would always follow that up with a question, which is, well, who gets the 1? And the 1 is usually the thing that you're exposing for. So if you're exposing for the 1 and the shadow is going to be below that, then it's a 1 to 2. Does that make sense?
Don't in Europe they say it the other way around?
They do.
Yeah.
It's twice as, it's double.
So if you have a 4 to 1 or a 1 to 4 lighting ratio, then the shadow side is 1/4 the amount of light. Sounds like a lot, sounds like a huge difference,
stops.
But 2 stops is
Reasonable.
It's reasonable.
There's detail, there's full detail there. And that's the thing is, ratios are a little bit of a tricky thing to define on how to measure. And the reason is because there's always one other question that has to be asked that people sometimes will forget to ask. And that is there a fixed fill light in the studio, or are you using a reflector for your fill? If you're using a reflector for your fill, you can move that reflector in and out and in and out and in and out and change your ratios all day long without affecting your exposure. But if you've got a fixed fill light in the studio and your main stays at the same power output and you're changing the relative output on your fill light, the power up and down on that, every time you change its power, you've got to get a new reading because you're affecting that fill light is also affecting the highlight side. So you've got to make sure that you know your ratios, whether or not you're working with a fill light or a non-fill light, because it really does it will mess with how you categorize your ratios, if you will.
I'm going to point a question to you,
sure.
and then I'm going to go grab something to answer another question.
Great.
So would you talk about power packs and using studio strobes on location? And gee, maybe that just might be a subject coming up in the near future.
That just may be a subject of an upcoming webinar. Working on location with power packs and battery operated strobes for me is a real sensible way to work. I'm not a guy that ever learned to, I didn't grow up with speed lights. I do use speed lights and I am learning to control these speed lights pretty well. But for me, working out on location with a studio light and these monolights, especially the Gemini series monolights, with the travel pack, small or large travel pack battery, to me makes a lot of sense because it gives me almost ultimate control. And I really, I'm not a photojournalist. I'm not a guy that's recording what's taking place. I'm creating something that doesn't exist. And that's how I differentiate what I do than what some people do. And so for me, if I take a model or a family and I'm out on the location, I'm going out in the park, I want to make sure that I've got enough light to where I can place them relative to the ambience of the background anywhere I want, anything that's required to pull off the shot. And I think for me, that seems to be more important than anything. Again, it might take a little extra time, but you know, in Hollywood, they don't shoot an outdoor scene in Hollywood without knocking down the ambience first and then relighting the actors. They always will put black scrims over top and close off an area with getting rid of all ambience, then lighting it. And you can still see the ambience out underneath. But they never allow that light to not be controlled. And I kind of feel the same way. When it's available to you, when it's possible.
Sometimes you're going to want to do something that isn't possible where you are. And there's a question here that require a lot of work to make this happen. So somebody says, at 250th of a second, at f8, it says 30% flash. But they want to shoot that same exact scene at 2.8 and get 30%.
Yeah.
And sometimes the answer is no, you can't have it. If you've got a really bright sun. Now, there are times when speed lights offer one specific advantage,
right,
and that's the ability to do high-speed flash sync, or high-speed flash. And what that happens is that the speed lights will allow you to sync at a 4,000th of a second or so.
Right.
So that's, if you have that very specific need, you're in bright sun, and you need to shoot at 2.8, your flash isn't going to be 30%, by the way. Your flash is going to become the primary light. But if you need to do that, then you're going to need to go beyond the normal sync speed of a studio strobe, which isn't something that is possible.
Yeah, yeah, it's very difficult to do that.
So the answer there is use the right tool for the job. A couple have asked about speed lights versus strobes. Not everybody has the ability to take their strobes on location and has battery packs. Light is light.
Right. And don't forget, you also have the benefit, and a lot of portrait people don't ever think about this. Commercial guys have to think about it, and they do know. But don't discount the importance of neutral density filters on your camera's lens and also neutral density gels over your lights.
Yeah.
Being able to power down things that are too bright. So you do have that ability as well.
Yes, so you can, remember, they're going to bring down your ambient, and you can then increase your flash power to overpower that.
Which can get you down to that 2.8 region.
So you mentioned our friend here, our little friend.
Yep.
And a couple of people have asked, and this always comes up, and we're going to do a lot more programs on this, subject for another day, but about metering multiple lights. So I'm going to hand my meter off to you. You'll hear Tony's take on dome in, dome out, and direction.
My take on, first off, before I talk about the multiple lights, my take on the dome in and dome out. For my testing and for what I've always learned, I think the dome should remain in when you're doing any kind of flat art copy work. So put that dome in, and if I'm got to photograph a painting, for example, for reproduction, I'll slide this around to all the four corners of this picture and in the middle, and I'll check to make sure that I've got absolute even lighting with the dome recessed. But for a photograph of a face, I'll always work with the dome out. And it gives me just a tiny bit more exposure latitude, and it more closely resembles the dimension of a face, I think. Pardon me.
It's really one of the main reasons for the dome.
It's one of the main
mirroring
reasons
the
for
shape
the
of
dome.
a head, yeah.
Now, then where does it get placed? So in this position, I'm aiming it right back at the video camera. And my main light is right here coming in on this side of my face, as you can see the shadow and highlight. For me, I've got some of the dome over here in the shadow. Well, that's a problem. I think the definition of an incident meter, which is also known as an illuminance meter, is defined as measuring light that strikes or falls onto your subject. Here, it's measuring some of the light that's falling on my subject, but it's not measuring all the light that's falling on my subject. So in order to do that, I just turn it this way. And as long as this is always fully illuminated by my main source of illumination, I can't make a mistake and I can't go wrong. And if I do what the meter says, my exposures are dead on every single time. When I do this, I get one reading, but if I move that light a little bit to the left, I get a totally different exposure. Or if I move it closer to the camera, I might get a different exposure. But if I stay with that light, no matter where that light goes, my exposures are always true. Now, in utilizing it from multiple lights, it's exactly the same thing. So here I meter, let's say I'm metering Joe's face, bam, I've metered for that flash. Now I've got an accent light coming in on his hair. I'll turn that meter around and aim it at that other light source and take another reading, and I'll just make sure with my free hand, I'll just make sure that this light isn't affecting the exposure. So I'm only getting the exposure on that dome from that light. So I'll just cover it up, take another reading, and I'll be real clear about what my exposure is there.
That was a very good pop sound, by the way. I thought a flash
Oh,
just went off.
I've got a lot of sound effects. My portable strobe is that one, and you open the aperture, it's that one. You close the aperture, it's that one.
It's those years in California.
There's a
you
lot.
can't
I got a
help
lot
it.
of them. Don't worry. I got more.
So for those that like to do dome in, if you've got a bunch of lights on the set and they're firing all the time, then if you're not maybe in a position that you can easily shield all the lights, then go dome in. And that's what I'll typically do if I've got 3 or 4 lights on a set.
Yeah.
Dome in will just keep that light from hitting and
Just
and
remember,
adding
it's
to the
going to be
reading.
very, very critical in your placement. If you're off
Yeah.
just a little bit, you might be off a third or a half of a stop.
And also, don't wear a white shirt in the
That's
studio.
a great idea.
Don't wear a white shirt because you're going to add a
You're
reflector.
You're bouncing light in there.
So stay dark there.
Yeah, good one.
So again, particularly if you're doing with a single light, and this is something that really that confuses people. Like Tony just said, measure to the light, not back to the camera. Because if you measure back to the camera and you have a very deep shadow on the shadow side of the face, it's going to end up giving you the wrong reading, and this is going to end up getting overexposed. If you're doing something like this and you think your shadows are too dark, you just need to bring in more light on this side. Bring in a reflector, add a second light to decrease that ratio. One time that you might want to meter back to the cameras if you have a whole bunch of lights on the set and you just want to kind of get a cumulative, because if you've got 2 lights at 45 that are big sources, like Tony just said, you meter to the light. Well, what happens if you have a second light right here that's contributing and is actually wrapping around to that side of the face as well?
Yeah.
That's the time that you'll meter directly back to the camera, because then both of these lights, typically if you have people doing 45 degrees
Sure.
on either side,
Sure.
both of those lights are contributing. So let's say that's f8, you got another light that's at f8 here. If they're both at 45, you're going to end up with something closer to f11 right here. So yes, it gets a little confusing, but the first thing is, as Tony said, get that one light perfect.
Yeah.
Get that one light correct and measure back to the light.
Yeah. One of the questions was, can you tell us why you moved to the octabox? I don't think I explained that.
Do you really know?
I think for me it was a combination of a large soft source that still can look directional and yet has a much softer fall off on the lower portions. For me, it's a different look for me. It's a little bit different. It's funny. All these light shaping tools that we have from a strip light, which by the way, I've used a strip light for a main light often, to a softbox, to a square softbox, to the octabank, to a grid spot, to a beauty dish. All of those light shaping tools, every one of them have a right to exist. They all do something different. There's not one tool that is the ideal tool. And I get asked that a lot. What would I buy if I go to the store? Do I get a 16-inch parabolic and put barn doors on it, or do I get a 30 by 40 softbox? And my answer is yes. You're going to need them both at some point. Which is why, you walk out, you can't see it from where we are, but this studio is outfitted with every light shaping tool there is. And it's because Jeff here, who shoots all the products, has to use different tools for different reasons. So all of them have a different right to exist, and they all use different tools. Faces, you can almost always get away with using a softbox on a face. You can almost always get away with using an umbrella on a group. You can almost always get away with using a beauty dish with someone with great skin. If you've got somebody with bad skin, beauty dish probably isn't your choice.
Too many shadows.
So all of these, just to sort of help answer all the light shaping questions, I think they all have a right to exist. We've been working on a little handout that we'll see how it comes along here in the next few months, basically showing the utilization of every single light shaping tool there is, so you can see what it actually does. So I think it's a big playground to understand and test these things and to find out what each of them do and what their most beneficial characteristic is for your work.
The fun thing is as we play with some of these light shaping tools, someone will come along and say, hey, how about? And use it in a way you didn't even think about.
Yeah, it's we discovered one time. Let me set my ballpoint pen out. If I have a pen here on the tabletop and it's this long, but it's only this thick. Well, if I light that with a strip light, a real skinny strip light, and light the strip light in the same direction as the ballpoint pen, I've got this wonderful soft highlight down the pen, right? But if I just turn that strip light 180, so now the strip light is going this way, it is a totally different picture. It's a picture that doesn't work. Does that make any sense? That's what I'm
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about. You've got to find the right tool for the right job.
We will dig through this much deeper as we go through the next
We
couple
absolutely
months.
will. Yeah.
The short answer is that all of these light shaping tools have either a different shape of light or a different fall off from the hot to the dark spot. And what kind of look you're going for. Someone mentioned specifically that kind of Hollywood portrait look.
Right.
I know we had talked about doing something with
Yeah.
that. It's going to have to do with what's the fall off
Right,
and
it
how
is.
directional is the light. Somebody asked about ring lights, for example.
Yeah.
Some of the specialty lighting, I know Tony's got that on his schedule.
Yeah.
So you'll see ring lights, yes, they have a very kind of specific fashiony look.
We are going to do a webinar coming up on unique light shapers, and certainly ring light, a Fresnel focusable light source, working with spot attachments and putting cookies in front of lights, that sort of thing. We're going to come up with all that over the next few months, so stay tuned for that.
One other metering question, someone said that they heard outdoors in bright light, meters can get confused. Real short answer, again for this, whether it be 758 or 478 or 308. The trick is don't let the sun hit the dome. So if you're seeing that specular dot of the sun, remember the sun's a point light source. It may look like it's big, but it's not. It's a really little tiny dot up there. Just shade the dome from the sun. Don't let the sun hit the dome. So if you see that little bright speck on there, take your finger and just position it in between the dome and the sun, so that, because the sun's going to cause 2/3 to a stop and a half, depending, underexposure if it's hitting this dome. So just shade the dome from the actual sun hitting it, and you're going to get an accurate exposure with your meter.
One of the other questions that came in was on location, working on location. Does it matter a lot in the open whether you use a softbox or an umbrella? Again, the answer is what's behind the subject. With an umbrella, whatever's behind the subject is going to be fully lit. With a softbox, it probably won't be fully lit. So it depends on the job itself. And if you're in someone's home and you're photographing a family, do you want what's right behind the family to be seen and well lit, or would you like it to be not well lit? That would be my determining factor between the softbox or the umbrella.
This is a little more of a technical question, and this is something that the answer might even confuse you a little bit. But the difference between 250 watt, 500 watt, 1,000 watt, 1,500 watt strobes, what does that watt thing mean?
Well, there's each of those those numbers he just said, there's one stop difference, twice the amount of light. If the difference between a 500 watt strobe and a 1,000 watt strobe is one extra full power of stop and output brightness. Now, watt seconds were initially named watt seconds because it's how many watts over a 1 second exposure is how they were first determined. All the manufacturers that make lights now determine their watt seconds a little bit differently. In Europe, some of them, especially in the Deutsch countries, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, they call them joules. And they rate their output based on joules. It's a little different than watt seconds. But sometimes in a power pack situation, for example, some of the manufacturers will rate their output at the capacitor. Well, the capacitor in a power pack is in the power pack. On a monolight, the capacitor is in the head. So it's a little different. So what I tell people, and what I wrote recently in one of our blog posts, is when you're going to go shopping for lights, take your light meter with you. It's real simple. Just go out and measure the light. When you're in the camera store, ask the guy behind the counter to turn on and power on the different lights that you're looking at. And at mid-range, put them halfway between full power and half power, or lowest power. Put them in the middle of the range. Take a meter reading at 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, whatever you choose, and make sure that output is a number where you could work in terms of aperture. So watt seconds, don't get confused with the number as much as what are they capable of doing. I usually, for most of my work, I'm using a 500 watt second heads. I've got 2 of the 500 Pro kits that I work with now, plus I've augmented that with 2 400 heads, and now I have 2 1,000 heads. But those just augment the 4 500s, and those are my primary lights. And with that, I can light just pretty much anything, and I have no problem at all.
One other thing about the whole watt second thing that people really don't think about is it's not just the ultimate power, but it's how many f-stops of tonal range from light to dark that those lights are capable of doing.
Yeah.
If you go with a 250 watt head or even lower than that, you're going to maybe have, 2 stops, 2.5 stops difference from light to dark. Where if you go to a 1,000 watt head or even just a 500 watt head, now you're going to be 4 or 5 stops from light to dark. So you might find if you want to create a big enough ratio, You're not going to be able to do it with a low wattage head.
Right.
You're going to need more wattage so that the difference between full power and lowest
Right.
power is enough of a difference for you to create those ratios.
Yeah,
and
good point.
just to jump back to these lights real quick, again, here's my commercial announcement on these lights. I've loved these. We've switched our studio over to these. If you want to change a stop on a Bowens light, there, I just changed it one full stop. So it's full stops, tenths of a stop, and it's that easy. And you can see there's a range here on this particular light. This is a 500R. We've got 5 stops range. So if you want to create those lighting ratios and you don't have that kind of range, it's much harder on a lower wattage strobe. So remember, it's not just power, it's the range of light to dark that this particular pack can put out. That's one of the advantages of the bigger numbers.
One of the questions that was looking for a comment, I said, I've heard you talk about using both speed lights and power packs. Is it not easier to use one system and not combine? Yes, it is. But the true honest answer here is that there are times when it's not feasible for me to travel with my mono lights. If I've got to get in a small plane, I don't, and I can't, for whatever the reason is, I can't take all my mono lights and all my heavy stands and all that. I can certainly throw 3 or 4 or 5 speed lights in a small duffel bag and go to work. So the answer is, yeah, it does matter.
Or if you jump McNally, you can carry 20.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. So yeah, I think that I think for me the main thing is, again, what is the end purpose of the picture, and how many controls am I going to need while trying to get from the beginning of this thing to the end of this session. I walked into a CEO, president of a small oil company in West Texas one time to photograph for an annual report, and I had everything in the world with me, and he's got twin windows that face north. And it was the most beautiful light in the studio, and I didn't use anything. I just used his natural window light. And it turned out to probably be a better picture than if I had tried to overthink it and tried to force the picture by lighting it. And I think that's something, too, that you have to think about, folks. Just because you can light it doesn't always necessarily mean that you should. So give yourself that opportunity to understand when and when not to utilize the lights.
And then the other side of that coin is you have to use what you have.
Right, that's right.
If you wish you had, 4 big monolights and you don't have them, mixing speed lights in is perfectly valid.
Yeah.
We just did a webinar that's actually, it's on the site right now, where it's exactly what we did. We brought a battery pack for the Bowens strobe, and for our fill-in hair lights, we used speed lights. Because it was easier to hang a speed light from a tree branch than to try to take one of these monolights and do it. So it's all light. It's just using what you got.
I do want to answer this one question. Most of the shots shown are landscape orientation, which gives an image a certain quality, but the use of portrait and square format has a very different quality. Do you have any reasoning associated with making such a choice? Yeah, we're broadcasting a 16.9 ratio.
Yeah, yeah, that's the reason.
That's it.
It just fills the screen better when we're broadcasting.
We're just trying to make this look nice.
Yeah, but we all.
I shot yesterday all day with these kids, and as we were finishing at the end of the day, Joe said, be sure on those horizontals, be sure and export them in the right format for the broadcast. And I'm like, oh man, I said, most of the stuff I shot was vertical. He's like, do the best you can.
Yeah.
It's Hollywood here. We're producing a video and we're trying to give you a great look here. But certainly if I've got a vertical subject, I'm shooting vertical. And I'm a guy that lived on a Hasselblad camera for many, many years. I love the square, and I've lived in the square. And I used to only have square images on my price lists. We never even sold 8x10s in my studio. We sold 8x8s and 10x10s. And so I understand that format issue. So it's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up.
One other thing, though. Bill McIntosh told me this years ago. The nice thing about shooting, and I've really become, because I do a lot of video work, I've become enamored with the whole 16:9 format of portraiture. There's another piece to that that's a commercial piece, commercial side or a business side of it. When you shoot a portrait horizontally, and maybe there's more of the environment or some open space in the portrait, you get to sell bigger prints.
Yeah, it's about head size.
Because, you need to have the subject certain size. Also, if you create a beautiful portrait for somebody, typically it's going to end up over the fireplace, over the sofa, that kind of thing.
Right.
And that kind of big horizontal portrait fills that space better. So if you're going to shoot a client's in their home, it's a good idea to know where they're thinking of putting it. If they say, well, I have this vestibule in the hallway and it's got to fit in here, well, then you know you have to shoot vertically.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, all of our cameras have huge amount of megapixels. We have a lot of flexibility. You can always crop a horizontal vertically. You can't crop a vertical horizontally. So you've got a lot more leeway in your format if you go ahead and shoot horizontal.
Yeah. One of the questions that just came in, how do you convert watt seconds to guide numbers? It's a little bit of a different equation. Guide numbers are a little bit confusing to some, but they're pretty simple to determine. I shot for many years with a small portable flash that had a guide number of 110. What that meant was you divide your distance into the guide number and it'll give you the exposure. So if I had a 110 guide number, at 10 feet, my exposure was f11. So anything that I shot at f11 was going to be perfectly exposed with that flash on full power at the 110 guide number. But if I was going to be at half that distance, or let's say at 7.5 feet, which is not half but between half,
we're going inverse square.
We're going inverse square, and I would go to f16. So my dance shots, I would set myself at 7.5 feet, shoot at f16. I'd back up and shoot 10 feet f11. If I did a group of 7 people, I would back up to 15, shooting 15 feet and shoot at f8. And my exposures were always dead on because of the guide number. So the guide number is a great rule to understand and go by, but it is hard to relate that to strobes.
And nobody publishes the guide number anymore.
Well, very few people do.
Yeah.
But it's hard to relate that to watt seconds because all the manufacturers release their watt seconds findings differently.
Yeah, don't get hung up on specs too much.
Use a meter is my response.
You know, Tony, we could go on for hours. There's one more you wanted to answer? There's one I'll answer quickly.
Okay.
Someone asked about if you're doing a hair light and you've got that 30% fill and you want to add another light as a hair light. I'm trying to think when that would happen. If you're out where you're only adding a 30% fill, chances are there's going to be some sun, but maybe let's say you're in the full shade and you're using a hair light. Generally for me, hair light, if the hair is dark, my hair light's going to be the same as the ambient. So let's say it's f8, my hair light I'll measure to f8. If it's going to be blonde hair, then I'll go a stop under whatever the main is. Whatever my main let's say the combination of the ambient light and that 30% fill gives me f8. If they're blonde, or f11, if they're blonde, I'll have my hair light at f8. If it's black hair, it'll be f11. If it's somewhere in between, then somewhere in between.
Yeah.
That's my short answer.
I want to respond to one more thing and then we can sign off.
Okay.
There was a question here about working with a black horse and a white horse, it's a little tricky situation. I didn't want it to slide by without addressing. Let me see if this makes any sense. For me, exposure is all about measuring and exposing for the quantity of light that is present, not for the tonality of a subject. And what I mean by that is if I've got a white horse or a black horse, I can't change my exposure. My exposure has to be the same if I've got the same amount of lighting either one. If I change my exposure for the black horse and give a little extra boost of exposure or overexpose or compensate in my camera for the black horse, then I've got a real tricky situation if somebody brings in a white horse in the same scene. Because then I've just nuked horse number 2 and I'm going to have a spike on my histogram that's unprintable. So you have to just keep that little note in mind that by utilizing the meter properly and doing what the meter says, it doesn't really matter if he's wearing a black shirt or a white shirt or a red shirt. My exposure is going to be exactly the same, and a white shirt will look lighter because it's white, and the black shirt will look darker because it's black. So exposure, I think, and I teach that it is always relative to the quantity of light that you have, not the tonality of the subject. So I just wanted to get that out there.
To that point, I've heard this come up a lot, and we've talked about it, like photographing dogs. You mentioned what you call a black lab.
A black lab is a light-sucking dog.
So if you've got it, let's say you have a situation you've got a black horse and a white horse together.
Yeah.
So your answer would be, well, what you need to do is throw some more light on the black horse, not increase your exposure.
And make that light on the black horse not front lit because because it just gets sucked into the coat, but from behind coming forward, so there's skim light almost accenting the horse's coat or the black lab's coat. That's the way to get more exposure.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, Tony, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Joe. This was fun.
This was a lot of fun. Guys, thank you for the questions. Holy cow, there was a lot of great questions.
Of great questions.
And we're going to use these to formulate what we need to make sure we spend some time discussing in the future.
You guys have control over our future webinars and a lot of the articles that I write for the teambowens.com blog. We take your suggestions seriously, and we're going to write about the things that you are most interested in. So, hope that's helpful.
Yeah, we will take all these questions and save them, and they will get used for the future stuff we do. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So that's all the time we have today. Stay tuned. Visit teambowens.com. You can see what's coming up there and the Bowens website. Our thanks to Bowens for sponsoring us. And of course for you guys. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for the great questions. And hope to see you online again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care, and hope all your pictures come out the way you want.
Bye-bye.